You are in the Big Pharma track of the Digital RESI Conference. This is the pipeline strategy for preclinical and early clinical assets panel. And today we have a diverse and distinguished panel of participants who will introduce themselves in a few minutes. Maybe I'll start and introduce myself. So I'm, as I mentioned, Lisa Mendoza, and I'm with Bayer's Open Innovation Center based in San Francisco. So I work with Chris Haskell, and I'm part of the Open Innovation Partnering Organization within Bayer. And maybe what's important for the participants is to understand the kind of partnering functions that we have within our organization. So I and my colleagues look at very early opportunities for partnering and collaboration. We run strategic alliances, we do search and evaluation, and we're typically looking to source early stage discovery programs up through clinical proof of concept. We work hand in hand with our business development and licensing colleagues who are in a separate functions. So open innovation is embedded within R&D, and BD&L is an entirely separate function. And we partner with them. Usually we hand opportunities over that look to be more licensing and or mergers acquisition. Earlier stage opportunities, we try to de-risk with, for example, collaborations. And then we also have a venture investment organization called Leaps by Bayer, which invests in really sort of transformational and potentially curative technologies. Some things that are a little riskier for our main pharmaceutical business, but that we really believe need investments and can provide potential transformational therapies. My background is I'm an immunologist by training. I've been working in this role and in San Francisco for the past 10 years. Prior to that, I was working as a researcher within drug discovery at Bayer, and before that at another pharmaceutical company, also a German company that Bayer acquired, Sharing AG. And so I think that's enough about me. Maybe we can go ahead, and if each of the panelists will go ahead and maybe give an overview of what they do, the therapeutic areas, and or whatever else you think might be interesting to this panel, just so that we get an idea of who you are and what your role is, and then we'll move into some other questions. So maybe if Fiona, you want to start from JLabs. And
okay. Nice to meet you. I'm glad to be a part of this panel discussion. Tracy said, my name is Fiona Mack. I am the new head for JLabs at the TMC, which is based in Houston, Texas. So I just came on board about a month ago, so still getting very new to the organization and the region, but certainly excited about the prospects I could have. For those who aren't aware, I mean, JLabs is really the incubator arm for J&J Innovation, which means we offer lab space to early startups and a very no strings attached model system. So there are actually 13 JLabs kind of spread without the US and also within Europe. And we're also potentially thinking about a more virtual model, really, you know, now that we're kind of in this context where not everyone needs to be located in a particular region, how can we continue to support the early stage startups, even virtually without necessarily having a selective footprint. So our J&J, as I'm finding out, you know, it's a very large organization with a lot of externally facing groups. But our particular group, as I said, is really looking for companies at very early stages, which could fall within our sector areas, so it's being therapeutic areas or within our consumer medical device, which you can afford to support them through the next stage. We can certainly go through a bit more detail about what that focus area could be, as we'll probably discuss a bit more in the questions, but that's just one aspect of the many ways in which you can interact with J&J at different stages of development. My background is I am a molecular biologist by training, mostly focused in oncology. I spent my early years in drug discovery at Pfizer, also working in the oncology division, evaluating a lot of novel modalities, antisense therapies, T-cell bispecifics, you know, all these things that are now kind of coming into the clinic and really kind of coming to fruition. But I'd worked with a lot of external collaborators at that point. And so I was really hoping to leverage a lot of those interactions in the next stage of my career. So I moved on to work for Roche, you know, a Swiss-German company, in that case, and I moved on from kind of doing preclinical work to early clinical development. So doing a lot of search and evaluation for programs up until phase 2 development, once again, kind of focused in oncology and really trying to complement or jumpstart the internal portfolio. And so I have a lot of knowledge on, you know, what large pharma is kind of looking for some of these earlier programs and really how you can kind of cultivate those relationships. My last stint was at Ipsen, which is a smaller pharma organization. And this time I kind of done a switch from rare disease to neuroscience, also an area where there's a lot of novel modalities being explored. And in this case, it's also I was working in an environment where there was not so much a strong internal R&D. The real focus is on clinical development. So that can also give you some insights on how you can utilize the resources of pharma to help support you, even if they don't necessarily have a research focus, but how really kind of some of their developmental emphasis also be used for your future progression of your program. So once again, happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Fiona. Jessica, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, I'm Jessica Droge. I currently head up the search and evaluation group at Amgen. And just a quick note on the business development group at Amgen. We are a relatively small group. We have search and evaluation, Amgen Ventures, alliance management, transactions. So if you ping anybody within the business development group, it will get to the right place. My group actually does all the search and evaluation for any product and any technology. So it's not regional, it's not by phase, it's just holistic. So we have people that are specialists in, say, oncology, and they do a deep dive all the way through their different technology, expertise, et cetera. My background is, I come actually from my doctorate is more on the infectious disease side, but even during my graduate school days, I worked in clinical development, researching vaccines for experimental vaccines for infectious diseases. And so along the way, I converted over to some different therapeutic areas, but continued in clinical development for about 18 years. I eventually found my way to Amgen and did clinical development at Amgen for a few years, and then converted over to the business development group and now run the search and evaluation group. Our areas of expertise are oncology, immunology and autoimmune disease, nephrology, bone, cardiovascular and metabolic. And we also look opportunistically at different areas that may be a good fit for Amgen, where we can add value and bring to patients in an efficient way. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure we'll get into more details later.
Great, thanks so much, Jessica. And maybe we can go now to Michelle, who is pretending to be in Crete or wishing to be in Crete. Or my background should be green rather than blue because I'm a little envious, but Michelle, please.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so I'm Michel Debar. I'm with MSD. For those who live in the United States and Canada, that's Merck for you. We actually have 4 different business development groups, and one is specifically for animal health, one is specifically for the manufacturing division, one is more on the commercial side for commercial and marketed products, and myself, I am in the largest BD group within MSD and Merck, which is within Merck Research Laboratories. Within the whole BD team, we cover everything from research collaborations with academia, with institutes or anything alike, but also on the asset transactions, options, licenses, acquisitions, as well as the investments. And we have different functions and different roles, of course, for that. Those collaborations where there's no involvement of funding or financing in terms of longer term spin-off, then that's a specific group that just deals with that. That's mainly the academic and institute collaborations. Then we have MRL Ventures, which is our venture arm. So MRL stands for Merck Research Laboratories, not to confuse with M or Merck Ventures. And they are based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but they have a global scope and a global investment scope as well. And that's a dedicated team who you can find on mrlv.com. And then we have the business development activities, and that's by far the largest group around assets and technologies. And for that, we have two different roles: search and evaluation, like myself, as well as transactions. So everybody that has some involvement in getting up to a deal with us will be seeing at least those functions involved. And to support our role throughout the world, we have set up 3 different geographically focused innovation centers. So I'm in the European Innovation Hub, as we call it, which is based in London, UK. And from there, we cover Europe and Middle East. We have a similar hub in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We have a similar hub in San Francisco, who covers the whole Pacific. And then we have, of course, a 4th hub, as you might call it, which is headquarters. And headquarters covers some areas where no hub activity takes place, but especially focusing on late stage. And that means anything after clinical proof of concept. So that means anything before clinical proof of concept, a bit similar like what Lisa said already, that takes place within the innovation centers. And that means myself focuses on discovery to clinical proof of concept opportunities. We work along 5 different therapeutic areas, which is oncology, which is covered by my colleague full-time. Then we have neuroscience, which is covered by the head of the Innovation Hub in London, and myself. I cover, or responsible at least for 3 other therapeutic areas, which is cardiorenal metabolic, which is infectious disease vaccines, and respiratory and immunology. I think that's sort of what I can tell you about MSD, and happy to take, of course, questions later.
Great, thank you, Michelle. And finally, our last, we say the best for last, Natalia. No.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm working for Emerging Technologies and Innovation for Eli Lilly. And emerging technologies are pretty much like Lisa in Bayer, and I think Jessica mentioned as well. So we are looking for anything from the early stages up to the proof of concept in clinical trials. We're working across all 5 indications of Eli Lilly, which are oncology, immunology, diabetes, pain, and neurodegenerative diseases. And so mostly focused on therapeutics, not so much on diagnostics or medical devices like Fiona. I'm based in London. We also focus on the therapeutic areas. So I'm mostly focused on Europe, but also work on some deals in the US. But my major goal is to find and support those companies coming out from European universities and from Europe. I'm also working with a number of venture funds where Lilly is investing to diversify our portfolio, where we also support and de-risk the companies before they enter our portfolio. So it's a strategic, but also commercial, so capital investment. Yes, my background, I'm a molecular biologist. My diploma in biochemistry, my master's in microbiology, and PhD in molecular biology. I'm focused on oncology. I used to work in Merck, in German Merck. So in the Merck Regional, as we say, Michael, sorry for that. We used to say for 13 years before joining Lilly 2 years ago. And yeah, so as we say, so very broad experience starting from oncology, neuroscience, metabolic diseases, endocrinology, and so far. And so
Great.
forth. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Thanks everybody for those great introductions. And I think that was a nice overview of what we're all doing and what our respective pharmaceutical companies are focused on. I think maybe as a first question, You know, in the context, and a couple of you mentioned it already, we're in this global pandemic, which has really sort of changed the way we live our lives, and by necessity changed the way we do business. And I guess I would like to put the question out there to the panel, in the context of this, you know, pandemic. You know, we have to do these virtual meetings, we do digital speed dating. Is this something that you see as a necessary evil, or is this the wave of the future, or maybe something in between? And maybe you can talk about that in the context of what happens to an opportunity that you might receive from an entrepreneur behind the curtains at your institution. And I don't know if anybody has a burning desire to go first and take that question, or I can maybe offer it to Jessica, if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all, and I'm sure others will opine as well. But I actually see a lot of opportunity, and I'm actually quite excited about some of the fallout of the pandemic, and this that allows us to come together in a different way. I don't think that there's any true replacement for face-to-face interactions, but this is actually, at least at Amgen, has elevated our interactions for these video calls. A lot of times our initial calls with companies or interactions with companies, if they're not at a physical conference, we're usually just on the phone. And now, I don't know about you, but I'm generally not just on the phone ever. It's always a video call now, right? And so we can quickly actually get to know each other, I think, much better and develop a better rapport. It's also much easier in terms of setting up meetings. I have to say, not many people are traveling, and so calendars are a little bit more free and you don't have to, travel across the world to have a face-to-face meeting. So at least initially, you can have some of these interactions far more efficiently. So I do think that there's positives, and I hope that we, after the pandemic has subsided and we're able to address the disease appropriately, we can come back and have more of these more physical interactions. I do hope that we retain some of this and even grow it more in terms from the IT side and the virtual side. But I do look forward one day to coming back to conferences, mingling, and it can't replace that informal, chit chat that you catch up with people in the hallways.
Great, thank you. Maybe Michelle, you're nodding your head. You want to
yes.
say anything to that? And also, I think if you could also touch upon, how does this impact how people meet you if we're not getting together, face to face at conferences, and how they can reach out to you.
Yeah. I think I can echo a lot what Jessica said, except for one thing, that calendars are absolutely not free in Merck and MSD. It's a complete nightmare to actually get hold of people at the moment. It looks like everybody is working around the clock and has more work than ever. I think that also is something I hear from a lot of external people we interact with, that there's no stop, there's no break really, like with the summer. It doesn't slow down. It went on, continues, and I think that counts for us as well. So the way that we interacted with companies prior to COVID was a lot through WebEx already, not necessarily with video. I think still the corporate culture with us is not that we switch on video, also to save bandwidth, I think is an important element. So we still have the audio part, so to say, and I think that might be slightly different than what Jessica said as well. So the way that we meet with companies hasn't changed really, because I think even the virtual partnering is the initial work that you do to meet is very similar, because you go on the website, you look at the profiles, you select them, you invite them for a meeting, if it's at a partnering conference, of course. A lot of that is very similar still. So I think that's basically the front end that determines almost like which companies you're meeting. What I did notice though, and I don't know whether that is something going forward as well, that by Europe spring, when one sort of around the lockdown in a lot of companies, went digital, and a lot of companies retracted themselves from participation because of the high cost. They didn't see anything really of added value for the same amount of money that would otherwise be physical meeting. So I noticed that there, at least, it was very difficult to meet with companies that I usually would meet. I think in the meantime, because people realize this is for the long term, we are going in this, we have to meet, so we have to participate to this. And there's of course a lot of this type of meetings ongoing at the moment. So it's now really the question, like which ones will survive, or which ones do you really put all the energy and the effort in. Let me stop there. Surely others have an opinion as well.
Great. Yeah, maybe just to add to what you've both said, I absolutely agree. I think that there does have to be sort of a balance between, you know, working nonstop because there's no sort of boundaries in terms of having to leave an office to go deal with personal and family life. But I think the other thing I wanted to sort of point out is that I've participated in a number of these partnering meetings, these virtual or digital partnering meetings, a lot of speed dating, which I think is worked out really well. But what I've really been impressed with is some of the scientific congresses, and that's a big part of where we do our partnering and find new opportunities. And you know, I think there have been a lot of companies that really sort of come out of the need to do all this virtual business. And a lot of the partnering meetings and the conferences, the platforms, I think are really quite good. That's been my experience. I'd be interested to hear what you all think as well. But the other thing that I've seen is that a lot of use of sort of whiteboard platforms like Mural or Stormboard or things like that, where you can really interact with other groups and network. And I think that, you know, there's clearly a need, and that need is being filled, that niche is being filled by companies that are stepping up. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Maybe Natalia, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, so I agree with everything you say, and I think I'm more on Michel's side in terms of the schedule. I mean, I think we are both in London, and now 7 p.m. or 7:30 p.m. almost, and we're still sitting in front of our laptops and working. And I think this digital RESI is a good example of working 24/7, because there are no times when we travel home. We don't need to jump in the car and go somewhere. We're just sitting and meeting people across the world. So. Absolutely. And but of course the COVID as a pandemic, of course, increased the number of deals as well. And so Lily did invest in the, I mean, as all of us, I guess, but we did invest in the neutralizing antibodies. Several COVID opportunities are on the way, and we hope to see the results of our clinical trials in the coming weeks. So it's really, and I think this add, of course, all to our search and evaluation teams, but kind of, you know, working around the clock. So we know we are now processing at least, so we just did an analysis, we're processing twofold number of deals, which we've done, you know, last year. So it's a very intense time right now, which is, of course, a great opportunity, I think, for many new therapies coming, but also an intense time for us. So I don't think we can work like this forever. But this is obviously, I guess, will convert into a great benefit for patients.
Great. And Fiona, anything to add?
Just actually how maybe it's changing a bit internally on how it works. So I've obviously onboarded a new job in this virtual environment, and a lot of how you said, or how these face-to-face communications are still very important. So for all of us that are all externally facing, it's still very important to maintain our internal relationships, to really understand our strategy. That's very kind of key to getting any of these deals done. And that is normally done by, you know, the traveling back and forth, having these conversations. But I've had to do that all virtually, working across time zones. We have colleagues in Shanghai and London, and just being perceptive to the scheduling. But what I have seen is a shift on, outside of these external conferences that we would normally have the bulk of our partnering, our initiatives internally to have more of our own funded or own managed conferences. So really having senior leadership be present at more of these scientific discussions, or setting up some of these smaller, perhaps more regional or at least therapeutic area focused meetings, so that we could utilize that as more of a scouting tool, under the same perception that a lot of these our partners really are also looking for opportunities to engage with our organization, perhaps outside of a RESI or a JP Morgan, where they can still kind of get a bit more personalized feel and still get the input from the high level stakeholders. So I think they're putting a lot of more emphasis on that and a bit more metrics, and using that as a very primary scouting methodology. But it's also been helping for me to really understand all the internal mechanics of the organization and helping to onboard in a virtual environment.
Great, thank you. I just want to remind all of the participants that there is a Q&A button where you can submit questions. I know we've already gotten a couple of questions come in, and we will try to address maybe the one or two of those towards the end of this panel, starting in around quarter till. In the meantime, please add questions that you may have. But let's move on. Thank you for those comments. I think very timely with the pandemic in place. So one other thing that I think would be really interesting to our audience, because I believe we primarily have new entrepreneurs participating as well as seasoned entrepreneurs, is maybe we could talk about what are the hot new areas of focus for your organizations. And maybe I'll start. One of the areas that we've been focusing on most recently is hot for everybody, and maybe not so new, but certainly newer to Bayer, is the cell and gene therapy space. This is an area where we see it potentially being able to impact a number of our therapeutic areas. We already have a gene therapy program in the clinic, our hemophilia A program, which is currently in phase 1/2A. And we're looking to move into cell therapies as well. So we recently acquired Blue Rock Therapeutics, which is an early stage cell therapy company developing treatments for Alzheimer's disease. This was a company that Bayer formed as a joint venture a few years back, and we fully acquired the company, I believe, end of last year, beginning of this year, can't recall exactly when. Our LEAPS venture group is also invested in Century Therapeutics, which is an allogeneic cell therapy company. So this is an area that Bayer is really trying to make a play in, to become a leader in. We have a number of other ongoing discussions, due diligences to try and bring more into our pipeline. And so this is a very hot area for us. I think some other areas that are really interesting that our LEAPS group is trying to focus on is the microbiome space, not only for pharmaceuticals, but also for crop science. And maybe our panelists can speak a little bit in terms of the therapeutic areas that are of interest to them, but also more particularly, where do they see things that are really hot and they think they may be moving into. And maybe Natalia, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you so much, Lisa. So I think so obviously the advanced therapies like cell and gene therapy is very interesting. So we are more looking into the gene therapies. And I think I cannot say that we are a gene therapy company already, but we are kind of preparing ourselves, and particularly seeing a great potential of this in neurodegenerative diseases. So the other area where we are very interested in is in the protein degradation. So, and this is of course in the neurodegenerative diseases as well as in the others, and of course the advances of PROTACs and molecular glues is very interesting in the recent years. So that's a very interesting area for us. And then the small molecules acting on the on the translation and transcription, so on the RNA. So RNA therapeutics is of great interest as well. So here, I think the field is still starting, but we are interested. And I think the deal with Anima, which we've done a couple of years ago, is a great thing, which we are kind of yeah. So we really very positive about this deal and would like to do more in this field. So I think these are the kind of the new things which are coming. So
great. Maybe Michelle, can you give us your input?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of overlap, I think, as well. We don't traditionally focus yet, at least, on cell-based therapies, but starting to explore gene therapies as well, like what Natalia said as well. The areas of senescence, the areas of autophagy, fibrosis, those are all sorts of processes / areas of interest. And what we started about 2 years ago, I believe, maybe 3, was thinking much more along processes instead of along therapeutic areas. So, for example, fibrosis is applicable in lung indications, of course, but also in cardiac and liver and kidney. And if you think about inflammation, if you think of neuroinflammation, and other areas, of course, as well. So much more thinking about processes and how can we utilize the knowledge, looking very often at one target from both an agonistic as well as an antagonistic direction, to see if we can sort of leverage the learning that you get around the biology into multiple different indications and areas of research and development. Already a long time ago, we also stepped into the microbiome. We have a dedicated team of 65 people working in Cambridge, Massachusetts, around microbiome as a theme. It's an agnostic group, so we don't focus on bugs as drugs, but really how can the microbiome be utilized to promote human health. For example, how can we improve responsiveness to immune checkpoint inhibitors or against vaccination. So this is all sort of around assets, and then of course in technologies you can think of machine learning in the drug discovery area, but also, and I'm not necessarily then thinking of Merck Research Laboratory SEC or what I'm doing, but for example, we have a huge program in blockchain technology for the whole manufacturing and supply division, which is all part of the innovation and developments within the organization. And I think that together with digitization also in commercial, to support patients in their disease course, in their compliance and lifestyle management, those are all areas where a lot is happening at the moment, and really the new focus is around, and of course all to serve ultimately the development of therapeutics.
Great, thank you. Fiona, do you want to go next?
Absolutely, yeah. As I said, on at least the therapeutic or the pharma side, there's obviously a lot of overlaps. I've heard similar stories at Roche, similar stories at J&J, which has made sort of heavy investments in gene therapy, also perhaps oncolytic viruses, and in that respect. J&J also just did the acquisition of Momenta, which is really a play within the autoimmune space. And I think what's interesting about that is not only are they kind of going after some aspects of a rare disease, but as Michelle was discussing, is like really more of this pathway analysis approach with this particular, where some of these targets may have applications across therapeutic areas. So in this case, kind of moving beyond immunology and also looking at neuroinflammation to particularly have a much broader scope on the impact. What is also kind of distinct for me is having spent, most of my career in pharma is really J&J's focuses on medical devices and also on consumer health. So their microbiome play is not necessarily it is from a therapeutic area, but really how you can comply it to skincare or these healthy babies initiatives, and any also some interplays with very specific women's health issues, which hasn't been a strong focus areas of a lot of pharma in certainly recent years, but they're looking to see how it can really be adapted to address, anxiety, inflammatory diseases, et cetera, but also maybe from a consumer perspective. So that kind of tie-in is quite different from pharma in terms of the regulation, but still have a very broad impact for it. What's also kind of striking is that how the company is approaching their utilization of data sciences. So unlike what Natalia had, or similar to how Eli Lilly, where we're not a diagnostic organization, it's kind of in contrast to Roche, but they still feel the utility of being able to use data sciences in applications to identify the appropriate patient population. How do we monitor clinical trials? What are reasonable endpoints for that? So they're always looking to partner with people who have a diagnostic focus, either from a clinical perspective, but even also how to apply that in the kind of consumer and self-care field. So we're kind of really focusing a lot on healthcare technology. Houston and Texas is actually quite a large hub for that. From UT Austin has a lot of that work going on. There's obviously at the Texas Medical Center, there's a lot of medical device from a surgery perspective, but also a lot of application on how to just improve surgery outcomes that the company is kind of highly interested in. So really kind of embracing that tech initiative and going beyond personalized healthcare to really how can you expand a lot of those resources to the consumer in addition to the actual operating room.
Great. And Jessica, do you want to go ahead and chime in?
Sure. Just a distinction probably to some of the other companies. Amgen is not a device company, and we're not an OTC company. So we're seeking different opportunities that will actually get us some type of innovative therapeutic, prescription therapeutic that can actually meet a grievous illness or disease. And we partner with diagnostic companies to be able to identify the patient populations where those therapeutics might be most suitable and to identify the patients that are most at risk. So in terms of the innovation that we're looking for, we have, I think at last count, maybe 13 different modalities in-house or with our partners that we work on. So we're kind of modality agnostic, but we're really looking for ways to identify new targets that can address areas of disease that haven't yet been able to be addressed in a compelling way, or methods to actually interdict a target, a known target that's been difficult to interdict to date. So some methods, you know, the protein degradation, the glues, et cetera, those are all of high interest to Amgen. We're also looking in the RNA space, trying to get outside of the liver, trying to be able to do some tissue targeting for RNA outside of the liver, as I mentioned. So those are kind of the ways we acquired a small company, New Evolution, that was able to provide us a large DNA encoded library that allows us actually to identify small molecule therapeutics that can interdict targets that are otherwise unknown or very difficult to target otherwise. So we're looking at these very unique platforms that can generate very efficient drugs that must offer some major compelling difference to the patient to be able for us to find the value to bring them forward in the market.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Well, I was just taking a look at the time. We have about 20 minutes left. There are quite a few questions, and one that came up from, I think it's Kent Cogentis, I thought was interesting because it also segues into a question that I was thinking of posing to the panel. And so what Kent wrote was, it seems that some big pharma companies make investments either via direct capital or via resources such as lab space, et cetera, outside of their pipeline priorities. Is it worthwhile, therefore, to reach out broadly in your opinions? And I think that's an interesting question for the panelists, and I'd like us to sort of address that from the perspective of whether that's something we welcome or not, but also what other avenues they might have, what they should do, and what they should maybe not do in terms of reaching out to different pharma organizations. And to that point, maybe Michelle, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I can speak for MSD, of course. We are focused on therapeutics, so we don't have lab space or anything alike. That's like the J Labs, for example, where we have a good example. So if you are talking about therapeutics, and I see also the second part of your question, like if neurodegenerative disease is not specifically listed on your website, you're hesitant to actually reach out. I would always advise to reach out, because you never know how companies operate. We don't work with wish lists. We don't work with we work with therapeutic areas, as I mentioned, but that's more to streamline the organization. In principle, we're very opportunistic and pretty agnostic. As long as it's a therapeutic area, or sorry, therapeutic modality, which addresses an unmet medical need, which has some form of novelty, either through novel pathways or chemistry or targets, and has, of course, a proper scientific data package underlying, I think it would be always of interest to have a chat. And I'm pretty sure that counts for all the panelists here online, that we all think similar. So definitely the don't do's, like don't withhold yourself of not reaching out, just try. And the worst case is you get a no, but that's most of our work, unfortunately, anyhow, say no. So I could definitely encourage people, yes.
Yeah, and I open it up to the panelists. If anybody wants to contribute here, let's make it a little more dynamic, and please offer a suggestion or a comment.
Maybe just not no, but maybe not now. I think this is another answer. So Michael, I won't be that radical, but most of our work is maybe not now, maybe a little bit later, or maybe yeah. So
yeah, I agree. I agree. We would like to actually keep the relationship with you reaching out. If you're, right now Amgen is not in neurodegeneration. We once were. We got out. We got back in. We might get in the future again. So it's just good to have that relationship, and it makes it easier for us to keep the communication going. So never be afraid to reach out.
Yeah, and I think maybe to add to that, there's a couple of things. So Michelle, you mentioned earlier that you're focused more on mechanisms rather than indication areas, and I think that's very true at Bayer as well. We were very focused on specific indications, and we've really shifted to more of a mechanistic focus in trying to be more opportunistic about technologies that maybe are more easily validated clinically in an indication that we may not have previously been in, but that mechanistically are very interesting and that could be relevant to other areas which we are already in. I think the other thing to mention is most of the companies here have venture arms, and at least for Bayer, with our Leaps by Bayer, they really are working in areas that the main pharma aren't working in. These are areas that are outside of our sort of maybe bread and butter indications like cardiovascular disease and oncology and women's health, but where there's still opportunity to collaborate, to license, to acquire. And many of us are sort of the first filter. So we may receive that information and we would certainly transfer it to our colleagues within Leaps or within late stage business development and licensing. So I would encourage you, I mean, yes, it is good to look and see what companies are interested in, but I also couch that statement in the context that we really are evolving to a more mechanistic way of looking at things. And so there may be indications that, aren't particularly relevant to what we've been doing, but that would offer a good entry point. And if it's the right mechanism and it's, a new area and a new target, please reach out. I think we want to see those kinds of opportunities. Anybody else want to add, Fiona?
Just to say, we're always looking for disruptive technologies or really addressing these unmet medical needs. And our current pipelines are just a snapshot of where our industries are at the moment. And certainly seeing that those change and evolved, and in many ways can follow the science. Like for example, with the momentum, that rare disease that it's being followed for an autoimmune disorder was not something that was on the radar for J&J, but it's something that they see value in the company and the platform and the true potential. So just having, as you said, a want list or a wish list is certainly not sufficient for those of us who are looking for, investments that will go beyond this year, that aren't necessarily near revenue generation, but really are the prospects of changing or disrupting either our internal culture or our internal pipeline. So certainly encourage. I also just many times, as Natalia is saying, you don't just get a no answer. Actually, you get feedback in a lot of those interactions. So even if it is out of scope, here's why, but here's like what we would also be looking for in a program of that stage. So it's always quite valuable to reach out and see, to gauge where the company is, what level of risk are willing to assess, where they want a particular stage, and then how they maybe can give you some ideas, particularly if you have a modality that can have multiple applications, but they'll be able to give you feedback of what is the most strategic interest of them, and then maybe perhaps guide you to your next stage of discussions.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, I think the other thing about partnering is that, it's an iterative process. So maybe not now, maybe later. But I think also you want to try and develop relationships with, the folks that you meet at these partnering meetings and folks like us, because you want to have within your network someone who you can reach out to at Bayer or at Amgen or at J&J, and even just to bounce ideas off, and new technologies that may be coming out that you may have access to. So I think you want to develop those relationships, but also, ideally, I've been the internal champion for a particular technology that I think is really exciting and potentially transformational. And oftentimes, initially I'm pushing that uphill internally, but it's because I believe in it. And if I believe in it, it's because you've convinced me, and I trust you because we've developed that relationship. So I think that relationship building is also so really important. I want to go to another question from the audience, and that is from Jim Iverson. So Jim asks, are your companies focused on COVID-19 treatments? When a vaccine becomes available, its effectiveness may be very low, requiring the need for other treatments. So where do all these pharma companies sit on the COVID spectrum, so to speak? Please, anybody join in.
Well, I'll just speak for one. J&J has a nice collaboration with BARDA to really help accelerate treatments for all pandemics, right? So not just COVID. And particularly some of the recent announcements for BARDA winners were doing as you had suggested. So we know that some of the vaccines may have not limited efficacy, but certainly may have a different efficacy across demographics, or particularly perhaps in an elderly population. So there's one program from Seven Hills, who's also a resident here at J Labs, who is looking to develop, a better adjuvant to boost the effectiveness of vaccines. Once again, not necessarily specific to a COVID, but it's certainly prescient at the moment to have that work. And so that's a new initiative between J Labs and BARDA. What comes with that is also, free space in a J Labs organization, particularly the ones in New York, Toronto, and I believe perhaps also in the DC area. But once again, these are kind of no strings attached, but what you get is a lot of the mentoring that comes with J Labs, plus the additional resourcing. And of course, J&J is developing their own vaccine, to get us all kind of back to work. But it certainly is something we're not just thinking about this pandemic, but the next one. How do we really foster that innovation in that space?
Yep, I could speak for MSD as well. We got currently 2 vaccines in development, one through an acquisition of Themis, an Austrian European company, which has just started phase 1/2 clinical studies. And then we have a collaboration with IAVI in the United States around the VSV platform, which of course we know very well from our Ebola vaccine. So that's on the vaccine side. Then we have small molecule currently in phase 2, which we acquired or actually licensed from the company. And in addition, we have 2 collaborations around peptides, and that is not so much focused around COVID-19 specific, but much more around pan-coronaviruses, because we want to be ready for the next pandemics when they arrive. Whereas too many people are still currently completely focused on COVID-19. We think a little bit ahead there and trying to be ready for the future, so to say. And that on top of a couple of collaborations we have around understanding actually what the virus is doing, what are the kinetics and dynamics, amongst others with Institute for Technology in Seattle. And that's just a few of the examples that I can share that have been disclosed. And I think a lot more is happening internally. We don't know everything either ourselves, to be honest.
So maybe if I can follow, so we just received today the results of our baricitinib trial. So this is a launch drug in autoimmune diseases. So we found that when you add it to remdesivir, you reduce the hospitalization time. So we are working, so we decided to focus on the things which we can do. So we're not that much of a vaccine company, so we did not really look in the vaccine space, but we were the first company, I think, who started developing neutralizing antibodies. So basically it's the first patient who recovered from COVID. We got the materials and we started to produce, together with our partner Upsilera, the neutralizing antibodies, as I mentioned earlier. So, and we are looking for a number of other things in this space. And similarly, I think to J&J and MSD, we are thinking, how do we how do we meet next time? How can we be more prepared for a next pandemic? So that's, I think, and I think this is the whole pharma thought right now. I mean, we did had MERS before. Why we were not alerted then? Why we're meeting this now? So I think it came to our mind as well. So we are pretty much looking to collaborate also with other farmers on how we can be better next time.
And from an Amgen perspective, we also, and congratulations to Lily on the berry data. I saw the headlines this morning, so that's great news. Similarly, we're testing one of our marketed drugs, Otezla, in a COVID consortium study. So we'll see that, and that's intended as part of the inflammatory process that's related to the COVID symptoms and severity. We also have early efforts in the antibody space, so as a treatment as well. We're looking at different binding epitopes versus kind of the first gen antibodies that are in the space. And then also we're looking at it, we have several years ago, as you may recall, we acquired Decode, which is a leading genetics company. And so they've already published, I think, several articles in NEJM and other leading publications in terms of the genetics, not only of the virus itself, but trying to identify risk factors for people that actually get more severe disease. So we're coming at it from multiple angles as well. So I think, and I just have to say, I'm quite proud of the entire pharmaceutical industry for coming together and collaborating and responding so quickly, and my greatest respect for all of the companies that are in clinical stage right now, developing therapeutics and preventive treatments too.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jessica. I absolutely agree. I think it's pretty spectacular how the pharmaceutical industry, together with philanthropic agencies and consortia, have come together to really sort of tackle this this pandemic. It's not just about vaccines, and this is not a virus that is anything like any other flu viruses that we've ever seen, like influenza, simply because it's such a disease that targets the vasculature and the respiratory, and there are going to be a lot of fallout, I think, in terms of those patients that have the severe disease but do survive in terms of their long-term, sort of survival. And so I think there's unfortunately a lot of opportunity to contribute to understanding COVID and these coronaviruses for the pharmaceutical industry. And Bayer, like I think every other company represented on this panel, is involved in looking at our own portfolio and trying to see whether or not there are drugs that mechanistically we can repurpose for different aspects of this disease, as well as, you know, being participants in a number of different consortia, really working together to bring all the resources that the pharmaceutical industry has as a whole to understanding, to treating, and to treating this terrible disease. So thank you for that. We're running short on time. We only have a few minutes left. And so I think in order to wrap up, there was another question that came again from Jim Iverson. Thanks, Jim, for the questions. And this is more of a philosophical question. So maybe we'll start with Jessica, and maybe in just a couple of sentences, what is your company's definition of innovation?
Well, I think we could probably come up with so many different definitions depending on the day and time. But, you know, off the top of my head, I think our definition of innovation is something that really moves us significantly forward in terms of developing meaningful therapeutics for patients. So something that is just not, you know, a little bit better, but really cutting edge in terms of either, you know, the identifying targets, identifying new modalities, making them better, making them more efficient, having delivery options that are far more compelling to the patient, et cetera. So kind of an all ambiguous answer, and I'm sure my colleagues will have some other good additions too.
Great, thank you so much, Jessica. Fiona, what's
Yeah.
J&J's definition of innovation?
Wondering if there actually is one, and I'll misquote it here. But you know, I certainly think of very novel ways to address the unmet medical needs. You know, for us, it really is, you know, what's not true to say, but really kind of focus on the patient. And is there really something that has not been identified at which we can have, once again, a very strong impact on, very agnostic of the modality, you know, in some ways of the therapeutic area, but really moves the needle forward in how we can treat patients in the future.
Great, thanks, Fiona. Natalia, how about Eli Lilly's definition?
So the ladies have done such a good job, so I think I have very little to add. So pretty much the same. So novel ways of treating either old problems or, you know, the most unmet needs. So it's a very good set.
Michelle?
Yeah, I'd like to pull it even further a little bit, because we do see a lot of innovation, for example, also in manufacturing and bioprocessing technologies, etc., all to facilitate ultimately the whole process and the whole life cycle, the whole chain from discovery up to commercial. And I mentioned earlier, like, for example, digitization, apps, anything that can really facilitate patient ultimately to improve its health status. So I think also there we're looking at innovation, and I think everybody agrees there's no single definition of innovation, unfortunately. But yeah, absolutely. And the rest is all concurring with what has been said already. Absolutely. Great.
Thank you. I don't really have much to add to those wonderful definitions. I think my colleagues here said it very well. I want to thank everybody for participating in this panel. I enjoyed it. I hope that you did too. I hope that the participants enjoyed it, and apologize to those who submitted questions that we didn't really have time to get to. But I would encourage you to reach out to any one of us if you want to continue the dialogue. And I hope that everybody has a great rest of your RESI virtual conference and a good week ahead. Thanks very much, everybody. Take care.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Bye-bye.